My father sold my house while I was living abroad, but he didn't know it was protected federal property, and that this decision would destroy everything. While all this was happening, I was on the other side of the world. When people imagine living abroad, they picture postcards, new cities, clean trains, cafe windows fogged by winter breath. They do not picture the particular kind of loneliness that creeps in at 2:13 a.m. when you realize your life back home is continuing without you, and you cannot feel the pulse of it. I had been in Berlin for 8 months on a research and consulting contract I'd chased for years, the kind of opportunity that looks like destiny on a resume. I told myself the distance was temporary, that my sacrifices were strategic, that I was building something that would justify the quiet ache of missing birthdays and Sunday dinners. The house was the anchor that made that story bearable. It sat on a tree-lined street outside Washington, D.C., an old brick structure with a slate roof and a porch that creaked in a familiar rhythm. My mother had loved that sound. After she died, the house became more than property. It became the last place where her presence felt tangible. I maintained it with almost ceremonial care, paying taxes, updating insurance, even funding specialized maintenance I barely understood, because the deed wasn't just a legal document. It was proof that something sacred still existed in a world that kept taking things away. I had arranged for my father to check on the place while I was abroad. He had a key, a list of trusted contractors, and clear instructions. Maintain, report, nothing more. He had agreed with a solemn certainty that made me feel safe. "I'm your father," he said. "I won't let anything happen to your mother's house." The email arrived on a gray Wednesday, buried between client memos. The subject line was short, almost polite. "We need to talk." The sender was my father. I opened it expecting a mundane update: storm damage, plumbing, a neighbor complained. Instead, the first sentence stole the air from my lungs. "I sold the house." No preface, no apology. Just that sentence, sitting there as if it were a weather report. My eyes ran down the screen in frantic disbelief. He wrote that he had handled the paperwork, that the buyer was serious, that the deal had closed, and that I should not overreact. The house, he said, had been a financial risk, and he had protected me from it. He ended the message with a line that felt designed to sound reassuring and ended up sounding like a threat. "Trust me, it was worth it." I reread those words so many times that they lost meaning and became shapes. I stood up too fast. The room tilted. I felt my pulse in my ears like loud footsteps in a corridor. I called him immediately. He did not answer. I called again. Nothing. I texted. "What do you mean?" He responded 20 minutes later with a single word: "Call." When he finally picked up, his voice was steady, almost practiced. "I knew you'd react like this," he said, before I could speak. I tried to keep my tone level. "Dad, you can't sell it. It's federally protected. It's not yours." Silence, then a sigh that sounded like he had been waiting to exhale. "You think those protections are magic," he replied. "They're paperwork. Paper can be moved." I did what you would have done if you weren't distracted over there. Distracted. The word stung more than I expected. I had been working 12-hour days to keep my career afloat and my mother's legacy intact. "Tell me exactly what you did," I said. My hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the edge of my desk. He hesitated, then spoke in a careful, clipped rhythm. He claimed he had found a legal route through a representative, that the property had been transferred as part of an estate adjustment, that he had acted under a power of attorney he insisted I had basically granted him by leaving him in charge. I felt my stomach drop. "I never signed a power of attorney," I said. He paused again. "There are ways," he said softly. "Don't make this ugly. The house was valued at $1.9 million. That money can change your life. I'm trying to help you." Help. That word, too, sounded like a weapon in his mouth. I asked for documents. He promised to send them. I asked for the buyer's name. He refused. I asked what he had done with the funds. He said, "We'll discuss it when you come home." When I hung up, my body went cold, the way it does when shock stops being abstract and becomes physical. The house was not merely a building. It was the last place my mother's handwriting still existed, labels on the back of family photos, notes tucked into drawers, a recipe card she stained with vanilla. It was also the one thing I believed my father and I held in common, a duty to protect what she left behind. Outside my window, Berlin kept moving. Trams slid along their tracks. People crossed streets with indifferent purpose. In that moment, the distance between my life abroad and my life at home felt less like geography and more like betrayal made measurable. I stared at the email again, and one detail that I'd missed finally rose to the surface like something floating up from deep water. He had closed the sale last week, which meant the house had already been handed to someone else, while I was still signing documents in a foreign language. Believing my father was turning lights on and off, checking locks, keeping promises, the thought hit me with such force that I had to sit down. And then, without warning, grief arrived, not clean, not quiet, but violent and loud, because it wasn't only my home he had taken, it was my trust. The next 48 hours were a blur of time zones and phone calls. I spoke to my U.S. attorney at dawn Berlin time, then to a title company in the afternoon, then to a county records office that put me on hold long enough for panic to become anger. Each call ended the same way. We need to see the recorded documents. The sentence was neutral, but it carried the weight of a verdict. By Friday, I had a digital packet of filings forwarded to me by a clerk who sounded tired and slightly sympathetic. I opened the PDFs in my small rented apartment and felt as if I were watching someone dismantle my life using ordinary office tools. There were signatures on forms I had never seen. There were notarizations I did not recognize. There was a power of attorney attached, my name typed in, my address correct, the date backdated to a month before I left. The signature looked like mine in the way a shadow can look like a person, familiar at first glance, wrong the moment you study it. My lawyer, Elena Martinez, did not raise her voice when she spoke, which somehow made her words more alarming. If this power of attorney is forged, she said, we're dealing with fraud. And if the property is under federal protection, this can escalate beyond civil court. That phrase, federal protection, had been a point of pride in my family. The house was part of a designated historical corridor. Its original structure had been documented, and certain transfers and alterations were restricted by statute. It was protected because it mattered to the community, to the country's narrative, and to my mother's obsession with preserving what was authentic. When she was alive, she treated paperwork the way other people treat religious texts. She filed everything. She annotated every letter from the county. She kept the federal certification in a plastic sleeve like it was a medal. I could hear her in my head as Elena explained the options: emergency injunction, complaint to the state attorney general, referral to federal authorities. I should have felt relief that there were mechanisms to fight back. Instead, I felt something darker because the documents proved my father hadn't acted impulsively. He had prepared. He had planned. He had built a small architecture of lies, sturdy enough to survive the first wave of scrutiny. What about the buyer? I asked. Elena paused. The buyer is an LLC, she said. A shell, newly formed. I stared at the screen. The buyer's name was generic, almost comical, something like Evergreen Residential Holdings. The registered agent address traced back to a corporate filing service. Whoever wanted my house had not wanted a human face attached to it. That wasn't just a purchase. It was a concealment. My father finally emailed again that night, as if sensing that I had moved from disbelief into action. You're letting lawyers fill your head, he wrote. You'll thank me later. The protections were a headache. I found a solution. The money is safe. Safe where? I replied with controlled precision. Send me proof of authority, proof of deposit, the closing statement, the buyer's contact. Minutes later, my phone rang. It was him. His tone had changed. The steady confidence was gone. In its place was irritation, edged with fear. You don't understand what you're meddling with, he said. This isn't just about you anymore. That line froze me. What does that mean? I asked. He didn't answer directly. He complained about taxes, about maintenance costs, about the burden my mother had left behind. He spoke as if he had been carrying the house on his back for years, as if my inheritance had been an insult to him. The bitterness in his voice was so raw it felt new, like a wound that had been hidden and was now ripped open. Then he said something that sounded like the truth slipping out by accident. I had debts. Real debts. The kind you don't tell your children about. I pressed him. He evaded. I demanded specifics. He grew quiet, and in that quiet, I could almost hear him calculating how much to reveal without destroying the last piece of his own image. I handled it, he finally said. I kept you out of it. I did what a father does. But fathers don't forge signatures. Fathers don't sell protected property through shell companies. Fathers don't trap their children in legal nightmares while they are thousands of miles away. The next morning, Elena called with an update that shifted everything. We ran the notary stamp, she said. It's legitimate, but the notary is reporting their stamp was stolen last year. There is a police report. I felt the room tighten around me. This was not a messy family argument anymore. It was a criminal pattern. Someone had access to stolen notary credentials. Someone had moved quickly enough to record documents before questions could be raised. Someone had created an LLC in advance. And my father was either the architect or the convenient front man. I looked at my passport on the table and realized, with a clarity that bordered on dread, that I had to go home. Not next month. Not after the contract now. Because whatever was happening, it had already grown beyond a simple betrayal. It had become a system of deception, and my name was stamped all over it like a target. I landed at Dallas under a sky the color of old pewter. The airport smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. And for a moment, I had the irrational hope that the entire thing had been a misunderstanding that would evaporate when my shoes touched American ground. But the hope died as soon as I turned my phone on and watched the notifications flood in. Missed calls from Elena. A message marked urgent, and like salt in an open wound, an automated email from a utilities company, thanking me for transferring service. As if I had willingly handed my home away. Elena met me in her office that afternoon. She laid out the facts with brutal clarity. The sale had closed. The deed had been recorded. The buyer's LLC had already filed an application to modify the property under a rehabilitation exception. Someone was moving fast, and speed was a strategy. If they can start renovations, Elena said, they'll argue the property has changed hands and circumstances, and it becomes harder to unwind. My father had not returned my calls since I told him I was flying home. His silence felt like its own confession. I drove to the house anyway, not because I thought I could walk in and claim it with sheer will, but because I needed to see it, to confirm it still existed. The street was the same. The trees bare in January. The air sharp. But when the house came into view, I felt my chest tighten. A new lockbox hung from the front door handle. A sign I had never seen before sat in the yard. Property under contract, no trespassing. And parked at the curb was a truck with a contractor's logo. A man stepped onto the porch as I approached. He wore a tool belt and the casual confidence of someone who belongs. "Can I help you?" he asked. His tone was polite but suspicious. I told him my name. The change in his face was immediate, not recognition, but alarm. "Look," he said quickly, "we were told the previous owner might show up. You need to talk to the agent." Previous owner. The words hit like a slap. I asked if anyone was inside. He shook his head. "We're doing an assessment. The new owners want to start work soon. Historic property, so it's all complicated," he said, historic with the weariness of someone who saw it as a bureaucratic inconvenience, not a living memory. I stood on the sidewalk and stared through the windows. The curtains were drawn. For years I had left them open to let the house breathe. Now it looked sealed, as if it were holding its breath against intrusion. I had the urge to run up the steps and pound on the door, to demand entry, to shout that the walls inside knew my name. But Elena's voice echoed in my head. "Do not trespass. Do not give them an excuse to paint you as unstable." So I stayed where I was, shaking with contained rage, while a stranger stood on my porch and told me to call an agent. That evening, my father finally agreed to meet. He chose a diner off the highway, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee cups that never empty. He arrived 10 minutes late, and he did not hug me. He looked older than I remembered, not in a softened, gentler way, but in a sharpened way like stress had carved angles into his face. "Before you start," he said, holding up a hand, "I did this to save us." "Save us from what?" I asked. My voice was too calm, which frightened me, because it meant the anger had settled into something colder. He glanced around, as if afraid of being overheard. "Debt," he said. "Medical bills, bad decisions, things your mother never knew." He swallowed. "I didn't want it to touch you. You didn't want it to touch me," I repeated. "So you forged my signature and sold a protected property through a shell company." His eyes narrowed. "Don't use those words," he snapped. "You have no idea what I was dealing with." I leaned forward. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me who pressured you. Tell me why the buyer is hidden behind an LLC. Tell me why a notary stamp used on the documents was reported stolen." The first time fear showed plainly on his face. He gripped his coffee cup too hard. "I didn't steal anything," he whispered. I met someone who said they could help. They had people. They said this was the cleanest way." "Who?" I demanded. He shook his head, and in that small motion I saw something that broke me more than the sale itself. My father was not the mastermind. He was the lever. Someone else had pulled him, and he had let himself be pulled because it served his desperation. "They said if I didn't pay," he murmured, "it wouldn't just be me." A coldness slid down my spine. "Are you saying you were threatened?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. He stared at the table as if the pattern in a laminate could offer guidance. "I thought I could fix it," he said. "I thought I could get ahead of it. Once the money came, I could breathe again." "And where is the money now?" I asked. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked away. The silence stretched long enough to feel like an emission. Finally he said, "It's not all available. Not all available." The phrase was devastating in its understatement. My father had sold my home, my federally protected legacy worth $1.9 million, and the money was already slipping through his fingers, into debts, into fear, into whatever system had convinced him this was necessary. I walked out of the diner without finishing my meal. Outside, the night air smelled like wet asphalt and exhaust. I sat in my car and put my forehead on the steering wheel, not because I was exhausted, but because I was trying to hold myself together. My father's betrayal was no longer a single act. It was a chain of choices, and the chain had links I couldn't yet see. I realized then that the fight ahead would not just be legal. It would be psychological, because the people who had taken my house did not only want the property, they wanted me to feel powerless. And my father, whether out of weakness or fear, had already helped them do it. The first letter from the federal government arrived in a plain envelope, the kind that looks harmless until you read the seal. Elena had warned me that once we filed our emergency motion and flagged the property's protected status, agencies might step in. Still, seeing my name printed above "Notice of Investigation" made my hands go numb. An investigator from the Office of Inspector General called 2 days later. His voice was measured, professional, and startlingly direct. "We have reason to believe a federally protected asset was transferred through fraudulent authorization," he said. "We're contacting you to confirm whether you executed a power of attorney permitting that transfer." "No," I replied. The word came out like a stone dropping into a well. "I did not." He asked for a timeline. I gave it. Departure date, my father's role, the email, the phone call, the documents. He asked for copies. Elena sent them. And then, like a door opening into a deeper hallway, more questions appeared. Had my father ever been granted access to my identification documents? Did he have copies of my passport? Was my signature on file with any banks he could access? Had I noticed any unusual activity in my credit history? Each question made me feel as if my identity was not entirely my own, like it had been lent out without permission and now had to be reclaimed. As the legal machinery started turning, my personal life cracked in quieter ways. Friends offered sympathy that felt thin. Family members, especially on my father's side, urged forgiveness, as if forgiveness were a moral shortcut that could replace accountability. One aunt said, "He's your father. He must have had a reason." I wanted to scream that reasons do not erase crimes. But I learned quickly that people prefer stories that keep families intact, even when the truth demands rupture. Meanwhile, the buyer's attorneys responded with a strategy as cold as it was predictable. They claimed they were bona fide purchasers, that they had relied on recorded documents, that they had no knowledge of wrongdoing. Their filings were polished, dense, and full of language that tried to convert my loss into a technicality. They argued that unwinding the sale would harm innocent parties. I read those words and felt my anger sharpen into focus. Innocent parties? What about me, locked out of my own home because my father's desperation was profitable for someone else? Elena's team uncovered something that changed the tone of the case. The LLC that bought my house was connected to a larger network of acquisitions, other historic properties, other rehabilitation exceptions, other owners who had been absent or vulnerable. It wasn't just a one-off. It was a pattern. Someone had figured out how to exploit the exact protections meant to safeguard heritage. They targeted properties with restrictions, because restrictions create confusion, and confusion creates openings. We filed a motion alleging a coordinated scheme: stolen notary credentials, forged power of attorney, rapid closing, shell entity purchase, immediate renovation attempts to complicate reversal. The judge granted a temporary restraining order halting modifications. It was a small victory, but it mattered. For the first time, the house stopped moving away from me. My father, cornered by subpoenas and the attention of investigators, finally broke his silence. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, looking as if he hadn't slept. He held a folder of papers in shaking hands. "I can fix it," he said, voice thin. I didn't let him in immediately. I stood in the doorway and watched him, searching his face for the man I used to trust. "You can't fix what you did," I said. "Not by yourself." His eyes filled, and for a moment I saw the father who had carried me on his shoulders when I was small. "They came to me," he whispered, "not with a gun, with paperwork, with threats that sounded like laws. They said you'd lose the house anyway because of violations. They said they'd report things, ruin you, ruin me. They said if I signed you'd at least get money. Who are they?" I asked again. He finally gave me a name, a consultant, who introduced him to a real estate solution group. He gave me phone numbers, emails, a meeting location. The information was messy, incomplete, but it was something. He had been manipulated, yes, but he had also chosen to believe people who promised him relief, because relief mattered more than my consent. As investigators dug deeper, the story grew uglier. The stolen notary stamp was linked to a burglary that had never been fully resolved. The LLC's registered agent was tied to dozens of similar entities. Bank records suggested that sale proceeds had been split quickly into multiple transfers, some to debt collectors, some to accounts that looked like laundering routes. My father's debts were real, but they had been amplified by predatory lenders who smelled weakness. In a hearing that lasted only 30 minutes, the federal attorney assigned to the case said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "This appears to be a coordinated fraud affecting multiple protected properties. We are treating this as more than a private dispute. More than a private dispute." I felt a strange, bitter comfort in those words, because I had spent weeks being told to keep it in the family, to make it quiet, to forgive. But the truth was loud. It demanded daylight. After the hearing, I drove to the house again, this time with legal permission to inspect. The locks had been changed, but the court order forced access. When the door opened, the smell hit me: first dust, old wood, and a faint trace of my mother's lavender cleaner. The rooms looked slightly disturbed. Tape marks on the floor where someone had measured, small sticky notes on walls. The house had been treated like a project, not a home. I walked into the kitchen and found the recipe card still in the drawer, exactly where my mother kept it. My hands shook as I held it. In that moment, I understood what I was fighting for. Not just money, not just property. I was fighting for the right to keep my life from being rewritten by other people's desperation. And I promised myself, silently and fiercely, if this system thought it could steal a legacy and call it business, it had underestimated the cost of waking me up. The case did not end with a dramatic confession in a courtroom the way movies pretend justice works. It ended the way real justice often ends, through accumulation. Evidence stacked, timelines aligned, patterns emerged. Small truths, verified one by one, built a structure strong enough to hold the weight of what had happened. 6 months after I returned to the United States, a federal grand jury indictment was unsealed against several individuals connected to the acquisition network. The names were unfamiliar to me: consultants, registered agents, a notary-related intermediary, but the language in the indictment was clear: conspiracy, wire fraud, identity theft, unlawful transfer of protected assets. My father was not indicted as a lead actor, but his involvement was not excused. He was described, in careful legal terms, as a cooperating subject whose decisions had enabled the fraud. Reading that felt like swallowing ice. The civil side of the case moved with its own heavy rhythm. The buyer's attorneys fought to preserve the sale, arguing again that their clients were innocent. But when federal investigators traced communications and payments, innocent became difficult to defend. The judge extended the restraining order and later issued a preliminary injunction. Renovations remained frozen. The house stood still, caught between theft and return. I learned to measure time in hearings. In one hearing, Elena presented a forensic handwriting expert who testified that the signature on the power of attorney was highly inconsistent with my authenticated samples. In another, an IT analyst traced the email trail that had delivered manipulated documents to the closing agent. In another, a banking specialist explained how the proceeds had been fragmented and moved like water poured onto cracked ground so that no single recipient held enough to be easily recovered. Each hearing was a lesson in how fragile ownership becomes when trust is weaponized. And then, a year after the email that shattered my life, the court ordered rescission. The deed would be voided because the authority used to execute the sale was fraudulent. The property would revert to me. The ruling was dense with legal reasoning, but the core was simple: the sale should never have happened. On the day I regained possession, I drove to the house alone. The key Elena handed me was new, cut after court-order re-entry. I stood on the porch for a long moment before inserting it, as if the act of unlocking the door carried moral significance. When the lock turned, the sound was ordinary. That ordinariness made me cry, because ordinary was what I had wanted all along. To come home without needing federal investigators and judges and forensic experts to prove I belonged. Inside, the house felt both familiar and altered. The air was stale from months of halted activity. Some rooms had been cleared of furniture, either moved for assessment or stripped for staging. It was as if someone had begun erasing my life and then been forced to stop halfway. I walked through each room slowly, touching door frames the way you touch a person's face to confirm they are real. In the living room, a faint rectangle on the wall marked where my mother's portrait had hung. It was gone. I didn't know if it had been boxed, stolen, or discarded as clutter. I stood there and felt grief rise in my throat like a tide. I sat on the floor in what used to be my mother's study and let the grief arrive fully. The house was back, yes, but something had been stolen that could not be returned by court order. The sense of safety that comes from believing the people closest to you will not exploit your absence. My father asked to see me after the ruling. I agreed, not because I owed him reconciliation, but because I needed closure on terms I could control. We met in a quiet park. He looked smaller, not physically, but spiritually, like a man who had been forced to look at himself without the comfort of excuses. "I lost myself," he said, voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting you. I was just terrified." "I know you were terrified," I answered, "but you chose to use my name. You chose to take my consent away. You didn't just gamble with a house. You gambled with our relationship." He cried. "I didn't. Not because I felt nothing, but because my emotions had been spent in courtrooms and late-night phone calls and silent drives past a locked door. I told him the truth as plainly as I could. He could cooperate fully with the investigation, repay what he could, and seek help for the desperation that had driven him. But trust would not be restored by tears. It would be restored, if at all, by a long pattern of accountability, something he had avoided for too long. Financially, I recovered only part of what was lost. Some funds were clawed back through restitution orders, but much had vanished into transfers that courts could not easily reach. The legal costs were substantial. The emotional costs were worse. Yet the experience changed me in a way that felt, paradoxically, empowering. I learned the language of deeds and injunctions, of fraud indicators and protective statutes. I learned that family is not a shield against harm. Sometimes it is the route through which harm arrives wearing a familiar face. Months later, when I finally rehung my mother's portrait found in a storage box mislabeled kitchen supplies, I stood back and looked at it until my eyes softened. I imagined telling her the story. I imagined her anger. I imagined her sadness. And I imagined, too, her insistence that legacy is not only what you inherit, but what you defend. I did not get back the year I lost. I did not get back the naive certainty that my father would always act in my interest. But I did get back the house, the federally protected place that held my mother's handwriting and my own history. And in reclaiming it, I reclaimed something else. My capacity to stand up, to speak clearly, and to refuse the idea that betrayal should be endured quietly. The last thing I did that night was open the front door and listen to the porch creak under my weight. The sound was exactly the same as it had been when my mother was alive. I closed my eyes and let it remind me that some truths survive even when people fail you.